Welcome back to JLF's Brave New World. Even as the impact of COVID 19 is sinking in and citizens across the world are learning to tackle a lockdown, we believe that this is a time when it is vital to allow for a free flow of knowledge and scientific information. JLF's Brave New World was born out of this intent. Those of you who've missed our earlier session today, The Crown, where Peter Morgan was in conversation with Ritesh Patra, and some of our other outstanding sessions with Stephen Greenblatt, Shubha Mudgal, Peter Carey, Siddharth Mukherjee, Robert McFarlane, Shashi Tharoor, Jhumpa Lahiri, Margaret Atwood, Siddharth Mukherjee, amongst many others, can catch them on our Facebook page, JLF Litfest, and on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF. Our official radio partner is Red FM Bajate Raho. Our second session for the day is Kiran Mazumdar Shaw on COVID, healthcare, and the life sciences. An important and urgent conversation between Kiran Mazumdar Shaw and writer and journalist Samanth Subramaniam on the challenges of the pandemic and India's response to it. Kiran Mazumdar Shaw is a pioneering biotech entrepreneur, a healthcare visionary, a global influencer, and a passionate philanthropist. She has scripted a hugely successful entrepreneurial story by building Biocon, an innovation-led global biopharmaceutical enterprise, which has made outstanding contributions to life sciences and research, drawing global acclaim. Samanth Subramaniam is an award-winning journalist. His most recent book, A Dominant Character, is a biography of the scientist and communist JBS Haldane. His first book, Following Fish, Travels Around the Indian Coast, won the Shakti Bhatt First Book Prize. His second book, This Divided Island, Stories from the Sri Lankan War, won the 2015 Crossword Prize for Nonfiction and was shortlisted for the Samuel Johnson Nonfiction Prize and the Royal Society of Literature Ondaatje Prize for the same year. Please remember to comment and ask questions by typing it in the comment section below. Do follow our handles JLF Litfest on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram to get notified on the upcoming sessions. In case any of you drop off due to bandwidth issues, and we know there are many, you can find us on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF. And in case we freeze, just hang in there. We'll be right back. Ladies and gentlemen, Kiran Mazumdar Shaw on COVID, healthcare, and the life sciences in conversation with Samanth Subramaniam.
Thank you so much, Sanjay. Kiran, thank you for being here. It's a pleasure to speak with you. We only have 35 minutes of conversation between us, so let me jump right in. Tell me about, just to sort of start on a slightly reminiscent note, I mean, where were you in late December or early January when you first heard about the strange new flu-like disease coming out of, or in China, in Wuhan at the time? And what did you think when you first heard about it?
Well, actually, I first heard about the seriousness or the concerns around, this particular outbreak when I was in Thailand, in Phuket, as a matter of fact. That was on the headlines on the newspapers, the local newspapers, was when I first started really noticing it in a big way. And of course, everyone in Thailand was wearing face masks, which is normally what they do. And what was also very noticeable was that there were very few Chinese tourists who otherwise would be inundating Thailand at that time. So this was sort of noticeable, but I hadn't really understood the gravity of this particular pandemic at that stage. And let me then fast forward to where I was in late February, early March, which I spent in the US, in New York and Boston. And it was very interesting. I left New York on the 7th of March for Bangalore when New York had only reported one case of COVID. Okay. And WHO had not yet even announced it as a pandemic. They were still debating on whether it was grave or not. And on the 9th of March, early morning when I reached Bangalore, of course that was the day that WHO finally announced that it was a global pandemic. But I must say that I was very impressed with the way India had already swung into action from early March. Because when I arrived at the airport, they were busy temperature profiling us. They were asking us to fill in these quarantine forms. And, frankly, I was a bit skeptical about what they would do with all the information they had asked us on those quarantine forms. And I was really surprised and pleasantly so when a week later a health official called up and said, "Hey, you were on this flight. Are you feeling okay? Do you have flu like symptoms?" And they said they were going to check on me every day till for 2 weeks. So I
Hmm.
thought that was amazing, for the health authorities to do this kind of surveillance.
Right. And what is out of, when something like this happens, when there is sort of an unknown disease on the horizon, it grows, it is eventually declared a pandemic. How does a company like Biocon react? I mean, what is sort of, how does it position itself to participate in the response to the pandemic? What did you do?
So of course, the first thing we did was as soon as I got back, and when it was declared as a global pandemic, we said, listen, we have to make sure that we actually respond like the government has responded. So we started basically doing the usual things of temperature checking every single employee and visitor that came to our campus. We of course started having these hand sanitizers all over the place. We started getting people to wear masks, and we started
Right.
practicing social distancing as much as possible. We started creating satellite food courts because that was where really we felt that the people were sitting close together. So we
Hmm.
really swung into action, and I must say, in a week's time, our admin really did a great job of at least trying to put into practice all these good practices that you normally would do to deal with a pandemic to stop any kind of infection or spread.
Right. Right. And were you sort of, I mean, I'd like to understand, I guess, in the early stages of something like this, whether it's in late February or early March, when the government gears up to mobilize a response to it. I mean, what is the nature of the collaboration between the government and industry? How do they draw upon your expertise? How do they bring in the kind of accumulated experience that somebody like you has at a time like this?
Well, again, the Karnataka government has always reached out to private sector to as partners, as two true partners. And this was no exception. I think as soon as the COVID pandemic was announced by WHO, I think the Karnataka government immediately formed a task force with the private sector. So they basically, we have an ITBT sector where
That's right.
Deputy Chief Minister is the Minister for ITBT. He immediately put together his task force with NASCOM, with ABLE, and with some of us. Like I'm the head of the vision group on biotech. Chris Gopalakrishnan is the head of the vision group on IT. Then we got others from the startup sector, and we really put together a very cohesive team of people who were asked to basically work out uh, work from home policies. Like, obviously the government was very keen that we immediately start looking at work from home because uh,
Hmm.
from 15th of March, if you remember, we had a 3-day curfew where it was like a practice round before the main
Right.
lockdown was announced on the 21st. So even at that stage, we had seen that, we need to be much more prepared than what we are today. And we all put our heads together and we said, look, let's start working from home. I'm on the board of Infosys, and I can tell you that Infosys basically swung into action immediately because I told them, I said, let's all work from home. And 93% of the employee strength of Infosys works from home today. So I think
Right.
very
Right.
rapidly.
Right. That's yeah, I see the value of that because of the strength of employees that your organization and Infosys would have. But I guess I was thinking more from the point of view of a scientific or a medical standpoint and from the point of view of the central government. I mean, I know, for example, there was a 21-member task force that was convened. Were you on that task force?
No, that was government task forces. But what I did was I basically started getting involved in. There is a sort of a fluid group of people who are working with the ICMR, with the Ministry of Health, and with Niti Aayog. And
Okay,
I was involved very much with inducting the private sector diagnostic labs to expand capacity, because at
right.
that stage we realized that we had to test a lot, and we realized that the entire testing had been confined to the public sector labs, and that all the hospital beds were really in the government hospitals. So we felt that if you had to expand the capacity of testing, then we would have to pull in private sector diagnostic labs who could quickly
Sure.
ramp up the number of tests. So I was tasked with by the government, by ICMR, to say, can you please get together the private sector hospitals who are NABL accredited, to see how they would be able to support this whole exercise. So we actually got together, and I got all of them together, and then we worked with the ICMR to see how we could roll that out, and it was done.
Okay, I see. Right. And
And
since
then
we're
of
on the
course,
subject of
and then of
testing, I mean,
course, yeah, I just
it,
wanted to finish it.
sure.
And then of course we found that although we had roped in all the private sector labs, suddenly we found that there were not enough kits. So we found that test kits were being rationed out. And because of that, then we also started making an effort to see how we could indigenously come up with our own test kits. And that's how a few indigenous companies quickly came up with indigenously developed and assembled test kits. And that's how we were able to then up the number of tests from just about maybe 10,000 tests a day to now I think we can do over 100,000 tests a day.
Hmm. And until then, the test kits were coming from China, right? They were imported?
No, no. Until
Okay,
then, the test kits were they were imported from the US,
from the US, I see.
from
Okay,
the US, yeah.
okay.
US and
Um,
Europe.
right. There's been a lot of discussion about, I mean, as you said, you were kind of advising the ICMR. There's been a lot of discussion about the pricing of these tests and the cap that the ICMR put of 4,500 rupees. And the interesting thing has been the disparity that some people have pointed out between the free tests in Bangladesh on one hand and half price tests compared to ours in Sri Lanka on the other. What was the rationale for why the Indian price was much higher, or why there was a price at all at a time when maybe there was a real rationale for keeping it either very low or possibly even extreme or even free?
Well, that's a question that I think we have to ask the government, because the government ought to have said that we want to rope in private sector, but we will, underwrite the testing. I mean, that would have been the simplest thing to do. But
Hmm.
basically, they felt that people could afford to pay for tests, and and what we did was that we basically then um, said to our to ICMR, please give us a price that you have basically what is it costing the government, okay? And that price cap of 4,500 rupees was actually set by the ICMR, because at that time we were importing kits, as I told you, from the US. And when you look at, I think people don't realize how you arrive at a cost. It is not just about the kit cost, it's about the collection cost, it's about the protective garment that you have to wear both in the lab and at the collections spot, when you collect the samples. It's about the sophistication of the labs in terms of the equipment you're using, the reagents you're using. The kit cost is only one. You have a viral collection kit, which is a separate cost. You have another processing, reagents that go on in the lab. And then you have a RNA extraction kit that you have to do when you get the samples. There's the viral collection kit, which basically is the swabbing that you do, the nasopharyngeal swabbing you do. You have to put it in a buffer that basically kills the virus, because it has to be safe while you handle the sample transfer, and
But
then to extract the RNA from that. So when you talk about the cost of the test, I think you are not looking at all the cost. Everyone is just talking about the kit cost.
But I'm imagining that the countries like Bangladesh and Sri Lanka face these same comparable costs. How were they able to make it
I
so
don't
cheap
think,
or free?
look, Samanth, I don't even want to get into that discussion because we really don't know what prices they're talking about. Everyone reports a kit price or a test price, which does not include a lot of things. So I don't think I want to get into that kind of a discussion because people, when I finally delve into it, they have not included this cost, they have not included that cost. It's very difficult to have a sensible discussion. I mean, there were lots of channels saying, "Oh, they are doing it free." It wasn't free; it was government paying for it. Some,
Oh, of course. No,
yeah.
nothing is ever free. There's no such thing as a free
So
lunch, as
I'm
we all
just
know.
saying,
Yeah.
even today, with the indigenous costs, the costs have been coming down. Now, if there's a bulk procurement, you can actually reduce the cost even more. This was one test at a time. Now, it's one test at a time is very expensive. If the government had said, "Come on, we want to procure 50,000 tests per lab," then there could have been a different pricing. But if you're telling the diagnostic kit, "Listen, you are out on your own and you have to go and collect and you have to test," there's no way of not coming to that kind of a pricing. So I think we have to.
So, were you disappointed that the government didn't offer to bear the financial cost of this?
I think there were many opportunities for doing that, and I really think that yes, I think these tests should be free. After all, it's a public health issue, and I think government and state governments and insurance companies ought to be underwriting these test costs. Not be expecting people to be paying for that test unless you have corporates who want their employees tested, because you can't expect government to be covering all the cost of every test. They should be covering the cost of symptomatic patients, people in the migrant labor, the poorer people who are in very crowded areas. Yes, I think the government ought to pick up all that. And Ayushman Bharat is paying for the price of the testing of those people. Okay, I must tell you that. What you can allow the private sector to charge for is what corporates need to do for their employees. Now, those are costs I think corporates can.
Sure, of course, yeah.
But I think the average patient ought not to be called to pay for that test.
Right. So that leads us on to the next sort of most, I guess the most natural question to ask next, which is the big elephant in the room, or the elephant in the Zoom, as the case may be. Are we testing enough? Is there enough testing going on, random testing in particular, to allow us to get a good idea of what to project into the future?
So, Samanth, I also used to keep thinking that we are under-reporting, and under-testing.
Yes.
Let's put it that way. I'm quite impressed with certain states. I can't say it's happening everywhere in the same way, but I can certainly tell you that in Maharashtra, they are certainly testing a lot. And you can see it from the numbers that they are reporting every day. It is increasing. In fact, if you look at some of the data that's coming out, Maharashtra, Gujarat, and Madhya Pradesh have high numbers, and it's increasing, which is what is worrying. You have states like Kerala and Karnataka where there are low numbers and it's declining. So that's a good indication. And then there are other states where, of course, there are high numbers, but it's declining. So these are the kind of metrics you have to look at. Now, are we testing enough? We are not testing enough, because obviously for a country of our size, we ought to be testing a lot more. But then it's difficult to test everyone. And when you look at the number of tests per million, we are very, very low compared to other countries, right? We are at below 100, whereas most countries are in the thousands.
Right.
So we are testing very low in that sense. But if you look at the TPR, or what they call the test positive rates, that's quite impressive, because we are at about 4.4%. Compared to many of the countries who are at 18, 20, 10%. So it shows that we are at a much better state today than many other countries. So from that point of view, I think we could do better. We must test more. And I can tell you that at least in some states like Karnataka, there has been a lot of good testing. Karnataka today is testing about 5,000 tests a day, which is good. Okay. And many states have also been sort of coming to those kind of levels. So I think you ought to look at data in very different ways. And I think some of the states have handled it very well because they've done it at district level kind of empowerment and management of the disease. So I think surveillance and safeguards have been very well enforced in many states, and that's why you're seeing such
Right.
good control. And many other states, you're not able to do that, and that's why you're seeing such spikes and surges.
Right. Because I guess, I mean, the pandemic is so unfamiliar to everyone, experts and laymen alike right now, that, I mean, even I've read, in early April, I think you feared that the number of actual cases out there is 4 times what is being reported. But now, more recently, I think you've said that we can't extrapolate from American and European data because there's something different going on here. So what made you change your mind or sort of alter your perspective on what's going on? Why is, I
No,
mean,
I'm not.
how,
I'm not. No, my perspective is that we are bound to have a large number of positive cases. I'm not taking away from my earlier comment that we are likely to have
I see. Okay.
many more positive cases than are being reported today. My thing is, my comments were about the death rate. Because
Mhm.
today they are extrapolating mortality rates and the fatality and severity rates based on what's happening in Europe and US. And there I don't agree, because I said, if you look at the social structure in Europe, where you have many of 50% of the deaths have actually happened in these old people,
Old age homes. Yeah.
right? Old
Yeah.
age homes. And we don't have that kind of social structure in India. So if you start extrapolating from that data and say, oh, that's what's going to happen in India, I don't agree. Because I
But
think
if the basic
Indian data
premise,
has to be based
yeah,
on Indian evidence.
right. But if the basic premise is that maybe as you said, there are 4 times the number of positive cases out there, isn't there an argument to be made that maybe we aren't quite collecting all the mortality statistics that might be coming out of this also? That data is also insufficient in some way?
I think we are collecting the mortality data very well. Okay, I've
Okay.
also been looking into this aspect. At least I don't have a countrywide details, but I've actually done some dipsticks, sort of looking at in terms of, say, Karnataka, Maharashtra, Delhi, and a few other states, and I've seen that
Hmm.
the mortality rates are not being misreported. Let's put it this way. I would,
Hmm.
in fact, Karnataka is even going one step further, saying they feel that many mortalities which are happening because of non-COVID reasons, but they're not checking those patients, those dead bodies for COVID. Whereas in Karnataka, they are actually checking people who are dying, uh,
Hmm.
even if they have a heart attack suddenly, they're still actually checking for COVID,
Hmm.
if it's positive or negative. So I think
Hmm.
they're being quite thorough about not missing a case, at least in many
Hmm.
parts of the country. So
Hmm.
I would not really. My main premise is that, look, we are a young population. 90% of our population is below the age of 60. And if you were to go by the data that you're seeing in other parts of the world, where 90% of the deaths are over the age of 60, then
Hmm.
good place. And I wouldn't mind seeing a lot of positive cases, and I would love to see all of them recover, because that's
Hmm.
what builds herd immunity. So
Hmm.
I don't think we should really worry about the positive cases. In fact, I would like to speak about another aspect, which is stigmatizing positive cases, because I think that's
Right.
a very, very big worry. But
Right.
I think you should be focusing on the severity and the fatality of the disease. So we don't
Hmm.
want deaths to rise, of course,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
we don't want severity to be such a big problem, because you'll overwhelm your hospitals. So I think from that point of view, I think we should really be keeping a watch on not the mild cases, and not the large number of positive cases that you get who are all getting well and can be, put into sort of quarantine centers that are a step down from the main hospitals, like is happening in many parts of the country, where hotels are being kind of repurposed into these quarantine
Right.
nursing homes. But I'd rather focus on how many cases do you have in the hospital, how severe are they, and how many deaths are you having. That is really going to be a very important surveillance,
Right. Right. And so to circle back to this problem of data that we need more of, which obviously we will get only with more testing, right? I assume that you need to test more. Uh, what, why, I mean, to put it from an extreme sort of layman's perspective, why aren't we testing more? What is holding us back? Is it the lack of kits, or is it the lack of like a bureaucracy that can carry out an operation like this? What is it exactly that is holding us back?
So right now, what is happening is we want to basically test people who are symptomatic, which
Right.
means that when people complain of SARI, that is uh, the syndrome that of respiratory syndrome that we're talking about, acute respiratory syndrome,
Infection.
infection, then I think you are going to see that not too many people are coming up with these kind of symptoms. At least, even if they have it, they're suppressing it.
Right.
That's why you're seeing the testing also at a very low level. As I mentioned, the stigma associated with SARI is quite high. So people don't want to actually even talk about flu-like symptoms. They'd rather kind of hide it and hope that they'll be okay, because they find that if they actually are, then if they test positive, apparently it is causing a lot of problems for their families, for their neighborhood, and all kinds of things. So that is what is really the big concern, and that's why we are not seeing enough people being tested, because they're just hiding it.
I think we're starting to get questions.
It's not for lack of tests, but it's really because of the fact that you have mandated that only people who are symptomatic should be tested.
Right. Okay. There's a couple of questions starting to come in, so maybe I can start taking them. The first one is from Dharini, and she is circled back to a question that we talked about earlier, which is the prices of these test kits and the cost of the testing. These test kits that we were originally importing, what were they priced at cost, and what does it cost now to manufacture indigenously a test kit that might? So, what is the breakdown of this cost structure?
The breakdown of the test kit is very simple. If you look at the cost of the kit was about anywhere between, at that time it was about 750 to 1,200. Okay, that was
these are the imported kits.
The imported kits.
Okay.
And to add to that the viral collection kit, you add to that the PPEs that were used in collecting the sample, and PPEs used in the testing lab. And that itself then took the price up to almost 3,400 or something to that effect.
Right.
To add the technicians, the technicians that are going to be hired for doing the test, and the operating cost of the thing was adding another, I think, 1,000 rupees or something. And that's how it was coming to that 4,500 rupees.
Right. Okay. Because I think Dharini's supplementary question is, and this is something I guess on everybody's mind, we talked about it before this session as well with respect to American companies, but the perpetual fear that people have that during a pandemic or a crisis, private companies will find a way to profit or profiteer from it. We talked about how some of the American companies are doing it. What is the justification for private companies trying to do that in India, or how would they? Why would they do that?
See, first and foremost, this was at cost. Okay, this was not there was no profit in this particular cost that I just mentioned to you. And I also told you that now with some of the indigenous kits that have been made, the price from 750 has now come down to about 500. Okay, so there is a saving in that kit cost.
Right.
But of course, there's, as you get now local PPEs, those days everything was something which you had only imported. Today, as India indigenizes this, hopefully that price can be halved for sure. And, if you do it at bulk volume, where you don't get one person taking one sample, then obviously you amortize the cost of your PPEs to a larger number, and so on and so forth. So I, for one, believe that, you will be able to come down to a price of about maybe 1,500 to 2,000 rupees per test for the PCR kit. Okay. And
right.
PCR tests obviously are very, very accurate tests, and your frontline testing has to be with PCR. But then what you can also do is you can start doing pool testing, right? and you can rapidly reduce the price. So the same,
Mm-hmm.
I'm just giving an example. If it's a family of five, okay, you can actually do one test for the family of five as a pool test. Okay,
Right.
give your samples as a family, and obviously when you do a pool testing and it comes out negative, then obviously you're all negative. If it comes out positive, then you have to test each one.
Right.
You
Okay. I
can
see what you
start
mean. Oh,
reducing.
yeah.
You can
So I guess
start.
to amortize, I mean, a couple of things to amortize. Of course, we'll have to do more testing so that we can amortize over a larger pool. I mean, I guess my question would have been
No,
to
but you
come
can
back to
also
my
do pool testing. For
right,
government
right,
point of view, you should
right,
be doing pool testing, and
right,
of course have also got to introduce the serological tests, which are much cheaper tests and they're rapid tests, and many of them are point of care tests. But those, unfortunately, there's a little question mark about their specificity. But what you do is you read it in conjunction with the PCR tests, and you actually get a very good readout about whether
right,
you are recovering from the disease, or whether you've recovered from the disease, or whether you're negative altogether.
right, right. Again, yeah. I mean, there are a couple of other questions. Again, to go back to something we had discussed earlier about why India is still even charging for these tests, but we talked about that, which is that the government's failure to subsidize this or to pay for it is a determining
Yeah, I
factor
think the
in.
main question was, why are you asking the poor diagnostic centers to do it free of cost? I mean, they
Well,
should.
I mean, only because we don't know if they're poor is the key.
I
To a
think that's
consumer,
very
we don't
wrong. I
know.
think I think Samanth, it's very wrong to make those kind of allegations, because people have to run their businesses. They have to pay salaries. They have to.
Absolutely, absolutely. I
And
completely
I think
agree.
it's very
Um,
unfair, because there's so much mistrust of the private sector, that either you say, tell the private sector, we don't want you to test, but if you get them to test, then you have to underwrite them. You cannot be expecting them to do it free of cost. How
that's
much
very fair, Kiran. I mean, I
cost?
completely agree. Nobody should take a
How can
hit
you
on
do
this.
it
I
free
mean,
of cost?
the only thing people are seeing is they're seeing it done
Yeah,
in
but
different ways elsewhere. And
we've become a very hypocritical society. On one hand, you want everything as a social welfare state, and on the other hand, you want also a capitalist free market country. Well, how is it going to work? You
that's
can
a good question.
stock market in
That's
which people want to invest, and then say no, everything should be a social welfare state. You have to make up your mind. Do you want a stock
okay.
market, or you don't want a stock market? That's very simple.
Right, right. There's another question about vaccines. In January or February, we were told that there would be an 18 to 24 month timeline before we would even have a vaccine, which is still much faster than most vaccines were produced earlier for other diseases, new diseases. Now we are told that there is a candidate in Oxford to be manufactured partly in India that may be available as early as September. And so I was wondering, from your point of view within the industry, what do you think of these hugely accelerated timelines? I mean, we have never, I mean, if we actually have a vaccine in September, 9 months from the start of the disease, it would be unprecedented in terms of how fast. And so, is it even realistic for us to pin our hopes on something like this? Is that something that you think is feasible?
Well, this is an unprecedented event. I mean, you cannot ever imagine that the world will come to a standstill with this global pandemic. So, obviously, you will have to look at regulatory pathways which are highly abbreviated or accelerated. And the way
Mm-hmm.
I think we have to look at it is that, look, under normal circumstances, why it takes such a long time to develop a vaccine is, of course, the first few phases are not so long. Like, to do a
Mm-hmm.
safety test is not so long. You can do it
Right.
in a month. Then you have an efficacy test in a smaller population, where you really
Right.
want to see that everyone who is inoculated gets the right response of developing the immune response to the antibodies and things like that. So that is generally done in terms of the safety efficacy study, and then you have a very large phase 3 study. By the way, in the phase 1 study, you do what is called as dose escalation study, really to know
Right.
exactly what dose should you be immunizing people. And in the phase 3, what you would normally look for is not just the titer of the antibodies that you have produced in your body as a response to the vaccine, but also the endurance of that vaccine. How long is it enduring? Okay.
Right.
Generally speaking, you want that vaccine to endure for a long time. So the fact that you're cutting short, you don't know whether that vaccine, because you're accelerated the development. Whether it has lasted for 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, that's why it takes such a long time to know what is the endurance of that vaccine effect, right? To immunize you for how long? That is
Hmm.
the questions you have to ask in a vaccine trial. But here,
Right.
because there is this urgency of mankind who need to be protected, I think what you will see is an emergency approval. It's not going to
I
be
see.
it is not going to be a regular approval, but it's going to be for emergency use. So in
Oh,
September, you are likely to, if all the the trial data look promising and look good, uh, they even in many regulatory cases you are giving fast track approvals if you really see good data in the right direction. So, here as well, if you start seeing good immune responses from the people who are inoculated, and if you see
hmm.
all the neutralizing antibodies and all the things that you look for in a vaccine, then what happens is that they can actually give you an accelerated approval as an emergency use vaccine. They will still probably give the final approval maybe in 18 months or 2 years or whatever it is, but they will keep extending that approval as and when they keep seeing more data. So that's how I think this vaccine will be used, because you
So
will
who gets vaccinated under an emergency use vaccine?
no, you can see under an emergency use, you will have to first start with the vulnerable people, the healthcare workers. Those are the people who are likely to
Right. I see. Okay.
dose of
I see.
vaccines. And then you will basically start, vaccinating a larger population as you get more comfortable with the data. So I would imagine
Hmm.
in September, the people who will be vaccinated are the people over 60, people who are vulnerable, the healthcare workers,
Right.
things like that.
Right. Okay. There's a couple of questions about something we talked about before this chat started, which is remdesivir, this antiviral drug that is suddenly showing "quote unquote" enormous promise in the US. They want to know your take on that and on Gilead, and whether you think it is something that will help the world turn a corner in this pandemic.
Unfortunately, not, because if you actually look at the data, it is not the magic bullet that we want for this disease. It is showing some good promise in, shortening some of the hospital time of people who are not very critical, but maybe moderate to severe kind of patients are showing some good response. Those are the patients who are anyway recovering and going out of hospital. So they're saying people like them who normally take 15 days to get out of the hospital are taking 12 days or 11 days. That's the
Right.
only promise it's showing at the moment. But it's
Hmm.
not really solving the problem of really saving lives, if you know what I mean. Today, we are seeing
Right.
a lot of people dying for various reasons. There's this this whole thing of cytokine release syndrome, and you've got all this thrombocytic uh, attack in the lungs and things like that. So I think that is not doing anything for that. It's just basically
Hmm.
remdesivir is only acting in patients earlier on and probably shortening their time in the hospital. So it is not really the wonder drug that it should be. So let's not get too carried away and too hopeful. But right now, anything that works a little bit is hopeful, right?
But what's the reason why we're hearing so much about it then? I mean, in the US in particular, it's being really promoted I mean, at least to read and see what the news coverage in the US, the officials are really sort of going to town on this drug.
Yeah,
What's the
because
reason
I
behind that?
think in the US they want any good news, so anything that has
Right.
a little bit of positive news is being blown out of proportion. Unfortunately, that's the truth.
Right. Right. I see.
Today, I mean, even if you look at the vaccines, obviously the Oxford vaccine is making progress. There's a German vaccine making progress. There's a Chinese vaccine making progress. But what you're likely to hear in the US is the US vaccines, right? So
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Moderna vaccine and the other vaccine, that's what they're betting on. Though those
Right.
vaccines are going to be very difficult to use because
Right.
storage conditions are so challenging. They are intravenously delivered. So those are not the vaccines that the rest of the world can really rely on. The rest of the world has to rely on the Oxford kind of vaccines.
Right, I see. There's a question that asks, what changes can we see in the healthcare infrastructure in India in the long term post COVID? I mean, what can we learn from this and potentially sort of apply to improve healthcare infrastructure in a way that hadn't been in place earlier?
Yeah, that's a very good question. In fact, I would say that this particular pandemic has shown up a lot of weaknesses in our system. At the same time, we've been able to cope with this in a pretty, impressive way. So if you look at the number of hospital beds that are created in the government sector, 100,000 hospital beds have been quickly created in the government sector, which is quite amazing. I mean, it's impressive. I'm sure a lot of the government hospitals have been upgraded in the meantime because this disease requires very careful handling. The kind of sterile conditions with which you need to manage the disease is also very high. So I think you got actually some of the standards going up. I think a lot of the nursing care, the doctors, in terms of how they handle patients, is very different from just their normal routine, right? And I think that has improved in a big way. But what we really need to do in a much bigger way is primary healthcare. Because primary healthcare is the one where you really need to make sure that you're getting everyone to come and report flu-like symptoms. So, having those fever clinics in the primary health centers, getting your whole public health system and your whole public health infrastructure improved is going to really be a very big need going forward. And I think the government will have to invest a lot more. Ayushman Bharat has obviously started off giving that universal healthcare to one start of our public. But I really think we need to go beyond that. And I think, this whole private public partnership that is happening today must be cemented in a much better way.
Right. Um, there are a couple of thoughts about, or a couple of questions about antibodies, antibody treatments that Biocon is working on. I mean, I don't know if this is something you're willing to discuss, but somebody has posed this question. Is that something you might be
Well,
able to talk about?
sure. I mean, basically, I think there's an approach saying that whilst we are waiting for a vaccine, is there something else we can do to mimic a vaccine? And the way you mimic a vaccine is really to look at the neutralizing antibodies, which are being developed by the body to fight COVID, the COVID-19 virus. And if you can actually develop these antibodies, and obviously in a bioreactor, and grow it at scale, you can actually basically deliver it to patients as a therapeutic vaccine.
Sure.
So that is an approach that many companies are pursuing. We are also looking at that opportunity since we have very large biomanufacturing capabilities. And if we can also look at developing antibodies at scale, that's also a good interim before the vaccine really kicks in.
And is there a timeline you have for that in terms of development? I mean, or to quote the questioner exactly, when can we expect this?
Well, we are actually in discussion with a couple of companies in the US who are already developing this. And, we hope that if we can actually partner them, we can scale it because they need, capacity. So we can actually do what Serum Institute is doing for the vaccine, we could possibly do for the antibody.
Right, I see. Final question, again from somebody in the audience, which is, we don't know enough about this pandemic, obviously, but there is a thought or a strain of thought that the virus will be around with us for a couple of years, maybe for the foreseeable future, as a kind of seasonal thing that keeps coming back in some slightly mutated form or the other. From within the industry, again, what are your thoughts on what the industry could do to prepare for a future that includes a recurrence of the coronavirus?
Well, you have to wait for the vaccine because that's the only way of dealing with a pandemic like this over a long period of time. Because right now, all that you can do is to basically start being very, very careful about not spreading the disease more. You have to make sure that you have safeguards and surveillance to make sure that you pick up every case in time and quarantine people and treat people early and hopefully it's you're seeing that more and more people are recovering from the disease very rapidly. So that's what you can hope for with all these other drugs coming out, right? Like remdesivir,
Right. Right.
the early stages. If you treat people in the early stages, it might not even get to the severe stage. That's the trial you really need to do. And if you can prove that, then that's a great contribution to this as a drug.
Right.
Of course, you need to look at many other drugs which are being tried, and if that is something that you can manage. I mean, we've had many of these viruses. You still have H1N1. I mean, it hasn't
Right.
gone away. You still have AIDS. You still have TB. I mean, I'm more worried about now the non-COVID diseases which might spike. So I think
Yeah.
we must understand that we are used to having these viruses around for a long time, but I think now going forward, I think people are going to be very particular about inoculating themselves against many of these viruses. I think many people have been, how many of you have had a flu shot, for instance?
Hmm.
A regular flu shot every year, the influenza shot. But
Right.
most
Right.
people don't do that. I think going forward, we are going to be very careful about making sure that we vaccinate ourselves against many of these viruses so that we start becoming immune and start
Right.
developing immunity to many of these. Like if we had a SARS virus, if we had a SARS vaccine, and if we had immunized ourselves, maybe we would have been in a much safer place, and we wouldn't have succumbed as we have done today to this virus.
Hmm. I mean, let's talk very quickly because we don't have much time left. But about the funding behind these vaccine models, we talked earlier before the chat started about how there was actually development work done for a SARS vaccine back in the early 2000s. The funding for that dried up almost immediately as soon as SARS evaporated. What is the essential problem here with how vaccines are funded today?
Yeah, so basically, I think again, that the most expensive part of a vaccine is the clinical trials and the the manufacture of the at-risk clinical quantities of the vaccine. Those are the
Right.
expensive parts. And I think it should be possible for governments and various other foundations who are actually supporting vaccine development to back these kind of these potentially pandemic viruses. So I think you have to look at pandemics in a much more serious way. I think this is a big wake up call for the world, because we now know that these infectious diseases are not just confined to the developing world. Today, travel has spread it all over the world. And I think, at least so far, the data is showing that the developed world is actually not, sort of able to, respond to this virus as much as maybe the developing world is. Today, if you just look at the fatality statistics of say Europe and US, compare it to a lot of the developing world countries in Asia, you will see that countries like Thailand, who has an excellent primary health center, or Malaysia, or any of these, we know how to deal with these viruses. We've had the AIDS experience in India. We've had
Right.
H1N1 experience.
Right.
We've actually know how to deal with these kind of epidemics.
Hmm. Hmm.
And perhaps that is one reason why we've been able to contain it and zone it and deal with it a little better than other countries who have never had to deal with this.
Right. Okay. Um, I think that was the last question. That might be all we have time for. So I'm going to hand it back to Sanjay. Thank you so much, Kiran, for being with us today, and thanks, Sanjay, for having me.
Thank you so much, Samanth. Thank you so much, Kiran.
Thank you.
As you said, it's a wake up call, and there is some good that's come out of it. You're talking about 100,000 more beds, better care service, but obviously the challenges are enormous. Looking out there, not just the health crisis that we're all faced with, but also really the economic impact that the health crisis has. So the faster we're able to solve the health problem, I think the
Yeah.
faster we'll be able to tackle the economic problem. But thank you both. Thank you very
Thank you.
much for that conversation. And thank you all for watching and being such a great audience. We thank our official radio partner, Red FM Bajate Raho. Please do remember to log in tomorrow, Sunday, the 3rd of May, for another set of great sessions brought to you by JLF's Brave New World. We have Going Viral, Roger Highfield in conversation with Ajit Lalwani. Two eminent scientists examine the front lines of the world's battle with COVID-19 virus and share their perspectives on different dimensions of the pandemic. Roger Highfield is the science director of the Science Museum Group, and he's in conversation with Ajit Lalwani, chair of infectious diseases at Imperial College London, who recently recovered from a serious case of COVID-19. This will be shown at 7:30 p.m. Indian Standard Time, 3 p.m. British Summer Time, and 10 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. The second session of the day will be T.M. Krishna in conversation with Maya Mirchandani. The groundbreaking musician, writer, and activist speaks with journalist Maya Mirchandani of his latest book, where the metaphor of the mridangam and its cultural history takes us on a journey across the structural inequalities of power and public performance. A deep discussion for our virtual times on society, tradition, and art. And this will air at 9 p.m. Indian Standard Time, 4:30 p.m. British Summer Time, and 11:30 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. For those of you who missed the extract from the Jaipur Music Stage archives, please stay logged on. We have for you the Chicago Children's Choir. They unite youth from diverse backgrounds and have become a global citizens founded in Hyde Park in direct response to the civil rights movement in 1956. CCC has grown from one choir into a vast network of in-school and after-school programs serving over 5,000 students across the city of Chicago. Here's presenting an extract of their performance from the Jaipur Music Stage, starting with a soul-stirring rendition of the Indian national anthem. Stay safe.
Ladies and gentlemen, please stand for the singing of the Indian national anthem. Jan Gan Man Adhinayak Jaya Hai Bharat Bhagya Vidhata Punjab Sindhu Gujarat Maratha Dravid Utkal Banga Vindhya Himachal Yamuna Ganga Uchchal Jaladhi Taranga तब शुभ नामे जागे तब शुभ आशीष मांगे गाहे तब जय गाथा जन गण मंगलदायक जय है भारत भाग्य विधाता जय है जय है जय है You make it
Namaskar. My name is Jahan Nabos, and on behalf of the Chicago Children's Choir, I'd like to say welcome. We'd like to thank our artistic directors, dear friends, Mr. Sanjoy Roy and Miss Anu Bahar, for inviting us, as well as the U.S. Embassy. We are very excited to be here with you all and to share in your culture. Your country is absolutely beautiful. The Chicago Children's Choir was founded during the height of the Civil Rights Movement in an effort to bring children of diverse backgrounds together through music in the Chicagoland area. We serve around 3,000 children now, and 50 plus years later, we're still continuing that mission by practicing a very diverse repertoire. In respect for time, we did make a few adjustments to the program, but we promise to give you a little taste of everything that we do. And by the end of the concert, we hope that you will feel our spirit as we feel yours. We'd also like to acknowledge Mr. Zishan Banawadi, whose family are natives of India. He played one of the leading roles, Shiva, in our world musical, Indian-themed world musical, this past December. And so we're very happy to have him. He started out the show. So again, thank you so much for coming, and please enjoy the rest of the performance.